It's my pleasure to be here. It's always an honor that somebody invites me to talk about the city of Paterson, where I was born and raised in Paterson. I grew up there. Now I live in Sussex. So think of your commute tonight, think of my commute. Yesterday I came up from DC with traffic, so that's how much it meant to me to make sure I didn't miss this appointment. So we did alter the talk a little bit. Now, the Victorian age really didn't make too much sense for me with American history because, of course, it's based on Queen Victoria's life in Europe, so that in England, so that would be 1831 to about 1901. But the same era is similar in the United States, really roughly about 1820 to about the First World War, but we have different titles for it, as you can see. And I wrote from the antebellum period. I guess I need my glasses here. I wasn't planning on reading off the screen. Every now and then. The Civil War era, I left out Reconstruction because we really don't have to worry about that with Paterson. The Gilded Age, which is really the heyday, and then the Progressive era, and then, we'll sum up the decline of things. Of course, every talk on the city of Paterson always begins at the Great Falls. I guess you've all seen the Great Falls of the Passaic? How many have seen Niagara? More people have seen Niagara than the Paterson? How many have seen Paterson Falls? All right, it's about even. Well, I'll give you some statistics real quick. The falls themselves are actually about a 70-foot drop, and if you were to stretch them out, they're roughly about 280 feet. They're comprised, the rock layer is basalt, and that was actually formed about 250 million years ago. So that was the beginning of the talk, when, you had the break of the supercontinent Pangaea, and it's really the last ice age that brought the Passaic River up by us. Otherwise, pretty much, it would have went straight through, maybe through Summit, Springfield, and then right out, because of the moraines and all was all blocked up. But again, on a good day, about 1 billion gallons of water flows over. Of course, if you've seen Niagara's about 170-foot drop. I don't know how long they are, but they average about 65.5 billion gallons. The only difference, of course, is if you were here 10,000, 12,000 years ago when our falls started flowing, you pretty much know where you are. Niagara's falls already receded about 7 miles from where they originally started. They figured another couple thousand years it's possible at the current rate of erosion. We may lose the American side. In about 50,000 years, it may have receded all the way back to Lake Erie. So it's a good thing you saw Niagara because it's not going to be around as long as the Passaic Falls. Now, what really gets Paterson started, and of course it's named after Governor William Paterson, we'll allude to that, but the very first private corporation chartered in the state of New Jersey was the SUM, the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures, which is a pretty common term for the 1790s. There was also the Philadelphia Society of Engineers and Manufacturers, etc. So I was like the romantic version of the way they called themselves. And of course, the art iconography, you have the beehive. They were going to be as busy as bees and as well as industrious, the way, bees work together in the hive. And then, of course, it's going to be very prosperous, and that's why we have the grape leaves and the grapes to prove bounty. Now, when they started this, the SUM, they really didn't know where they were going to put this. They were putting their prospectus out from New York, Philadelphia, New Jersey. New Jersey was the one that accepted it. And who really did a lot of the pushing, of course, was Governor William Paterson, who was our second governor, although never elected. He's more known as a Supreme Court justice, as you can see in this life drawing from 1804. But he's the one that said, you know what, we'll buy it. That's November 22nd, 1791. Now they got to figure out where to place the town, so they start seeking men out, going around, looking for a strong river. And really what was decided by William Hall and Joseph Mort, they thought the Great Falls was the perfect location. However, I got to be honest, it was the perfect location because Alexander Hamilton did have a little influence. I'll get to him in a minute. But really, what it was is the money was mostly coming from the New York area, so you could keep a better eye on it. Thomas Marshall, who was another director of the society, really wanted to put it either down south. He was looking more South River or so, or in the ambush, because he thought the water was better there and you had less severe winters. But he was kind of voted out. So ended up Paterson is fixed where it was. And of course, Alexander Hamilton had a lot to do with the SUM. When you read Paterson's history, we always, since about the 1850s, make him he's like Saint Hamilton, and he's the founder of the city of Paterson. Really, he was engaged as their lawyer. They hired him to do the original contracts, and pretty much, I got to be honest, if you've got the real gist of it, most of the things that Hamilton actually had his hand in failed. with Paterson. Again, he had his problems too. I mean, he was in his office in New York, but from Jefferson and the rest of them, they really didn't understand the idea of a manufacturing society. So they charged him in 1790 to do a report, which he delivers before Congress December 5th, 1791, which is his report on manufactures. And really what he's pushing is the only way we can truly enjoy the political independence that we just achieved through the Revolutionary Wars if we couple it with economic independence. However, Thomas Jefferson and a few others really didn't like that idea. They thought the only way a man could truly be free, or a woman, is if you're tilling the land and you're landowners, and you would have that freedom. Where he felt if you were a factory worker, you could be subjected to the will of your, bosses. But he would come around, I got to be honest. Now, you all know what Hamilton looks like. The fellow on the right is Tench Cox, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He doesn't get enough of credit for his report, but actually he's the one who really understood how a manufacturing town should work, and Hamilton knew how to finance it. And together they were able to draw up this report, which unfortunately was the only thing that was rejected. But it was really part of his three plans. His three plans that he had actually was to assume the debt from several of the states from the Revolutionary War, pay off those debts, set up a central bank, and then have our own common currency as opposed to every state. That was Hamilton's plan, and manufacturing was the last part of it, which would have included immigration, protective tariffs, etc. But it wasn't accepted. As for Paterson itself, it does get off the ground. And the very first period is about 1792 to about 1797. And it does go from small town to about 500 people in total. And really what they do is they dam off the Passaic River, so actually they block the flow of the waterfall. I'm sorry I don't have a pointer with me. But where the red dot is actually corresponds to the drawing by Anthony Latrobe, who, after the War of 1812, would actually restore the White House after it was burnt to the ground. Another story. Anyway, they had their very first factory here set up here in the spring of 1793, and it was called the Bull Mill. Just a little to the where the first intersection is on the map. Are you okay with this? Okay. Anyway, it's called the Bull Mill because the raceway system wasn't completed for another several months, and since they wanted to get some production going, they figured we'd just attach a couple of oxen to it. And that was about the beginnings in. Oh, you got a pool cue? Yeah, I could use that for what's coming up. Anyway, actually, it would go bankrupt by 1797. Oh, this is awesome. Thank you. Don't give this to my wife. Anyway, by 1797. They're really not making a go of it, but the biggest problem they have is they can't stop British imports, or French imports. So a town of 500 dwindles down to about a town of 40. The SUM sells off whatever properties it owned. It owned about 700 acres above and below the waterfalls. And it was going to, under Hamilton's idea, they were going to be a national manufacturing. But it just never happened. So it collapses and it goes, dormant. War of 1812 shows up. We have British embargoes. The factories are laying vacant. Boom! It's a bust town again. I mean, a boom town again. 1813 through 1815, over 1,500 people have removed themselves, come back to Paterson, got all the factories working. Everything's great. The war ends, peace ensues, and the products start coming right back. And this is the very first protective tariff that the U.S. government established, which is the Tariff of 1816. And I mean, we had tariffs in the past, 1789 or so. It was really just a way to, raise money for the government. But this was particular to protect our, common goods, and especially keeping cheap textile products out. So, it added a tariff to it. And by 1824, even more significant tariffs would be added. And this is what really fosters and lays the groundwork for the future of Paterson. One of the earliest shots I have of Paterson from 1834 is you'll find in the New York Historical Society. A lot of the images that you'll see here, if I haven't got them from our own collections, it's either from the New York Historical Society, Library of Congress. I mean, there's a whole lot out there, even probably for the history of Woodbridge. If you look through halfthetrust.org, you may be familiar with that site. It has 1 million books on it. All the best history books on Paterson, I no longer have to buy or copy. They're almost all available online, as well as the libraries in Princeton and what have you. So this is a general view of Paterson, looking up what would be from Garrett Mountain, which is part of the First Watchung Mountain Range, looking down into the valley of the Passaic Valley. And you can see during the very first period, the antebellum period before the war of secession, you can see how the population grew. I don't know what happened in 1840, a bit of a panic in 1837 I know we had, and that would have reduced the population a little bit, but after that it grows off in leaps and bounds. And what really saved the factories, though, I can't emphasize enough, is the tariff of 1816. But really the genius behind Paterson is Roswell Colt. Now, he's not the first Colt. The very first Colt that was brought to Paterson was Peter Colt, who was treasurer for the state of Connecticut, and he replaced Pierre L'Enfant. Again, when you hear Paterson history, we always throw the big names around. I mean, he got fired from Washington, D.C., and then we hired him, and then we fired him. Although from the board of director minutes, he always kept asking for his 1,500 pounds that we owed him. I don't know if they ever paid him, but he never did anything more than a few sketches. As for Peter Colt, you know, he resigned in 1797 and the board of directors dismissed him, although he believed it could work. And what happened during the War of 1812 is he moves back and he really pushed his sons to buy up as much stock of the deflated stock of the SUM. And of the 1,960 shares that were available, I mean, no, there were 2,160 shares, 1,960 became the possession of the Colt family, so it really became a private corporation. And Roswell Colt turned them around. Instead of that, we got to be this national manufacturer and own the working, housing, own the factories. We're going to be the power supplier. So they sort of became like PSE&G. And that's what they did. They had the raceway system, and that was the most valuable commodity, as well as they could negotiate the leases. And you can see where his house was originally. It was on a sandy hill. This is the falls right down here. This is the waterfalls. This is the industrial complex. He actually put his house right in the middle of the nice Georgia-style mansion. Had an amazing greenhouse because horticultural magazine in the 1830s was always writing up whatever plants he had and all. And he always won a lot of awards too. But he was really first and foremost a businessman. He had married well. He married Robert Oliver's daughter. He was from the Boston area, very wealthy. So again, married well. She divorced better, though. They kind of separated because she didn't want to live in Paterson so much, and most of the correspondence was in New York, where they were much happier, or at least she was. So they kind of split up, but they had 10 children. And since, she brought the original money, she was allowed to pick at a litter, so she took 6 of the children with her, and 4 stayed with him. And most of what I'm telling you is related to us through Trumbull's History of Industrial Paterson, which is published in 1882, and he's a newspaper man. I got to tell you, even if you don't love Paterson history or history in general, this reads like a novel. Again, it's a newspaper. It's really thrilling. And I got to be honest, I never read the Civil War chapter at the end. It's like about 3 or 4 pages. Like, after I read it, I was ready to volunteer, and that's no joke. I mean, it was like so exciting. I was like, I'll be damned. Anyway, but what's funny is he's now we're sarcastic in New Jersey. I don't think we were sarcastic back then, but he does talk about that they were starting to get back together again, and then he says where negotiations abruptly ended when she died. I read that twice, and it's like, I don't think he's trying to be funny, but it reads better today. So again, the genius behind Paterson, to cut it short, is actually Roswell Colt, not Alexander Hamilton. If anyone deserves a statue to him, should be him. And this is about the earliest shots I have of the raceway system. The raceway runs roughly a mile long, and it would power actually all the factories from 1794 into 1859. They relied solely on water power, turning water wheels and through flumes. Again, the earlier shots of Paterson, and just the way the industrial town, of course, grows up, it needs the river. So all the factories are right along the Passaic River. This is actually the end of the raceway, where everything sort of goes back. Again, the nice thing about a canal system that, it takes the water, diverts it from the Passaic River, and then it just brings it right through town and back into the river. So you don't really use up your system, and it didn't pollute either. The water wheels would slowly be replaced. By the 1840s, almost by 1850, everything was turbines, so we didn't use water wheels too long. But our number one production, though, from the 1820s really is cotton. Cotton starts as early as 1816, again, right after the war, is what, once we're not doing wartime production. By 1822, the very first power looms are introduced. And they're going to be introduced by a gentleman who settled in Paterson during the war, which is Thomas Rogers, who we'll get to in a minute. I circled the one building there with the steeple. That's actually the old gun mill, they call it. And it's probably one of the more significant buildings in our history because it's going to be where Sam Colt's going to put his first revolvers into production, as well as the silk industry is going to start there. So just to give you an idea. And that mountain with that beautiful sway in the background, that's Garrett Mountain. Of course, that little hump that, the way it flows there, Route 80 and Route 19 have obliterated that view, unfortunately. But it does look that way. And again, cotton mill for sale, 1835. It really was a boom town. I like this, 20 girls, they're ready to hire. Actually, one mill was asking for a family. It wanted mom, dad, and 4 kids minimum. And again, the earlier days, you did keep the family unit together. It used to be called like the double pioneer. You left one country to another, as well as, besides changing cultures, you left from, being a farmhand to a factory hand. So initially they kept everyone together, but as you know, New Jersey's pretty progressive. By 1874, we did have compulsory education, so you had to go to school, much to the chagrin of children. However, the very first Sunday school, again, education with children was always important. The very first Sunday school in New Jersey is 1793, is by Peter Colt, opens a small school in his basement. And the first schoolmaster will be Robert Wright. But they didn't hire him. It took a while for a search. So the very first teacher was actually Sarah Colt. She was 13 years old at the time, but she could read and write. So, she could do it. When I ever talk about Sunday school to kids, they think it's like religious instruction, and it's like, no, it was not. You got that in church. It was the reading, writing, and everything. I mean, it was school. So imagine your normal work week, which was 68 and a half hours, typically, Monday through Saturday. Sunday's your day of rest. You got to go to church, and you got to go to school. Things are a lot nicer now, aren't they? And this drawing from about 1830, that's the gun mill right here, just to get an idea. And looking again along the Passaic River. As I said, cotton was king in Paterson, actually from about 1825 to about 1850. Now, I always knew, and most of you should know, we're the Silk City. I mean, that's our nickname. Well, before we were the Silk City, we were actually Cotton Town of the USA. That was on the previous slide. I had never heard about that, but from about 1828, that was our big push. And our main product actually was cotton duck for ship sales. That's what was one of our largest, products. And when you look at the early money from the old Paterson Bank, you can see they have, spinning frames as the symbol of what the city is about at the time. Although that little newspaper clipping talks about the very first strike, and Paterson's always been a hotbed of labor. I'll say the first successful strike. It was about 6 weeks where they call it the children's strike when you research it sometime. It was 6 weeks that they shut down in August of 1835. And what they were doing was trying to get a shorter work week, which they actually did win. So instead of 13 and a half hours, they got the 11-hour workday, which was pretty successful. And instead of being paid $2 as a flat fee, they actually had a pay scale of $1.90 to $4. I don't know if anyone ever made $4, though. No proof of that. As I mentioned, the one who actually brought in the cotton duck factory was John Colt. That would be Peter's son, Roswell's brother. They pretty much, again, the Colt family really sews up everything. And they pretty much run the SUM in the city of Paterson, just to cut to chase, from 1814 up into 1899, either directly or through marriage. By 1900, they pull out of, being the governor of the SUM, and it only goes on another 45 years before they dissolve and they turn over everything to the city of Paterson. Now you see that's the John Stevens schooner, the 1851 America, that did the regatta where he changed the chart. Sorry, I'm late. It's a little late. Anyway, he drove his schooner across the Atlantic where he challenged the Brits, and he won. And then became that 100-pound cup that was later dubbed the American Cup, which I guess we had a hold on for about 135 years before we lost out to the Australians when they cheated with the catamaran. And actually, I think it's this year it starts up. But quite the amazing thing. But of course, the end story is the ship sails. They were woven in Paterson. That was our big deal. Most of the ship sails did come from Paterson and Massachusetts. We can't take soul claim. This is actually the earlier shots that I have, and probably the best shots of the old gun mill. Although I have to say, the gentleman standing in white, you may see in some of the history books labeling him to be Sam Colt. I would dispute that, and that's probably John Ryle, who was the inventor or brought the silk industry to us, mainly because those skylights are cut in 1846, and the gun mill shut down by 1842. But let's talk about Sam Colt. This is the Colt that everyone knows. I'm mentioning Roswell, Peter, John. Nobody knows who they are. You mentioned Sam Colt, the gun who made us all, man who made us all equal with the revolver. Well, he had the shortest tenure in Paterson. And it was really his cousin Roswell that brought him there because he could arrange for the financing. Sam had the patent, but he didn't have the money behind it to, engage in manufacturing. So the period's very brief. They built that four-story building, which only the bottom two floors are for the Patent Arms Manufacturing Company, it was called. The third and fourth floor were actually a cotton mill. So it was always for adaptive use in a tenant mill. As for Sam, he built revolvers, which, even in his day, he was credited as being the inventor of the revolver, but he didn't. Elijah Collier invented the revolver back in 1818 and had a patent for it, which he sold to Great Britain. Now, I only mention this because Sam Colt gets the idea when he was 16, he served on the Corvo, and while he was watching the capstan, as they would roll up the anchor and how it ratchets and stops, that's where he got the idea to mechanize the revolver. But he spent a month or so in Calcutta. So he would have seen the British military there, and they were using the Collier rifle. The main difference with the Collier rifle was every time you fired, you had to rotate it by hand. So imagine after 3 or 4 shots, that cylinder was pretty hot. So he came up with this idea, and of course he patented. And all the financial backing came in. There are no 6-shooters in Paterson for our pistols, but they were in the long arms and the rifles. And all the firearms are sold as case sets because you need all the accessories to make them operational. The only problem he had a very good product. He introduces the factory system. This is what Sam's real big credit is. He brings the factory system assembly line production to firearm manufacturing. So that's what he's king with. However, it's relatively peacetime, not only in the United States, but in Europe, where he actually had his very first patent. So he's got no one to sell these to, and he's having difficulties trying to get military contracts. There were 2 successful purchases for him. One was when Zachary Taylor, or who would be future president, that's not him though, that's, as you can see, that's General Thomas Jessup. He purchased 180 or so revolving rifles for the Army, which were during the Seminole Wars in Florida. And pretty much the success of the factory and them are run hand in hand. And this is the second Seminole Wars. They would go up to almost 1860, the Seminole Wars. That's how long the fighting would start and continue. But he liked the firearm. And more importantly, of the Texas Rangers, the Texas Navy had owned about 300 Paterson pieces, which they had bought. The Navy was disbanded. Actually, no, Secretary Taylor disbanded the Navy, I'm sorry. And what he did is he created the Texas Rangers. And the most famous Texas Ranger was Jack Hayes, again, fighting against the Comancheros. Every man had 2 to 3 firearms, so they had 10 to 15 shots. That was the biggest thing. Where at very first, when they were, engaged in the war, the enemy assumed after you fired 1 or 2 shots, you had a muzzle loader and you had to reload. They didn't realize they had 10 shots readily available because you had an extra cylinder on top of it. So it was a very effective weapon. But other than that, there was no military applications. I will give you one story. What he did try to do is, he was the ultimate showman. To make some money, Sam Colt used to sell laughing gas hits, nitrous oxygen. Anyway, so that's one thing, but he was the ultimate showman. And what he does in 1840, I guess it's President Van Buren, he figures he'll give him the first would be equivalent to like a 21-gun salute. Now what he does is he has his riflemen lined up, and as he's waiting for the president's coach to come up, he figures, we're going to do something really spectacular. He's going to love this. So as he gets very close, and again, this story is, again, Trumbull's History of Industrial Paterson. And he talks about, now he's all ready to fire, and then he says, horses, the troublesome beasts that they are. So this is going to go south real fast. Anyway, he gets close, they fire, it scares the hell out of the horses, they bolt. The coach runs down the road, strikes a curb, the driver gets thrown, he gets impaled on the fence. And needless to say, the President of the United States was not impressed with this firearm. That was being the ultimate showman and not, checking out all the things that could go wrong. Back to the gun mill, the upper floor. This is where the Silk City starts, in that attic floor where I mentioned that the skylights were cut in. The very first silk machinery was brought by Christopher Colt, another Colt, Sam's younger brother. Their father owned in Hartford, Connecticut, owned the Connecticut Silk Works. That failed after several years, so Junior took some of the looms down and tried to get some cotton spinning and something. He really wasn't successful. After 3 months, he abandoned it. When George Merry came to town, George Merry was 80 at the time, and he had met this gentleman who was only in his 20s. That's John Ryle that you see in the center there. He came over from Macclesfield, England, which about 15,000 people by 1870 would actually descend upon us because of free trade agreements, the Compton Chevalier deal with France, which would flood their markets. But he comes early in 1840. His brother Reuben and Williams have extensive mills there, and he's really sent to sell finished products in New York. Instead, he starts running mills, but with the help of his brothers, he would end up buying that whole mill and then extending his own works. But John Ryle would be the very first to get silk onto bobbins successfully. And really, we didn't do broadcloth really until the 1860s. Silk sewing threads was our main product when it came to silk. Cotton, again, still dominated, but it was pretty stagnant with growth. But we did do one giant thing in 1853 when you had one of the World's Fairs in New York. Now it's in Bryant Park. We had the Crystal Palace. John Ryle had woven a special flag, which was 20 feet by 30 feet, the largest silk flag ever done, and done on Paterson-made looms. So that was, one of the highlights of the day. The one who built the very first power loom in Paterson was Thomas Rogers. Thomas Rogers settled in Paterson during the War of 1812. I mentioned him earlier. He's a direct descendant of the Thomas Rogers who came on the 1620 Mayflower, although that Thomas Rogers did not survive the first winter. Actually, we have his lineage back to 1453. And when he first opened up his works, he would hire anyone as long as you were a member of the Church of England, which he just didn't want the Dutch working for him, I suppose. Originally, he started working with John Clark. The very first machinist in Paterson comes in 1800 as John Park from Paisley, Scotland. And what happens is he's really there to, service the looms and help build looms. Rogers hooks up with him and later forms a partnership with John Clark Jr. And then eventually they form Rogers and Clark. And then Clark Jr. gets moved out and it's Godwin, Rogers and Company. And they're really thriving. In 1818, he has a patent for his own loom, which he's actually selling to Mexico as well. So through the 1830s, he's like, this is really doing well. In 1831, he asks, what is his share worth? And the company tells him it's worth about $38,000. I don't have the equivalent, I'm sorry. So he says that's how much he thought it was overly inflated, took the money, and he forms his own company called the Jefferson Works, right on the Middle Raceway. That's the Jefferson Works right there. That actually represents the corner of Market and Spruce Street. And what he did on the bottom two floors, he was producing cotton spinning machine, and on the upper floors, he was doing his own cotton spinning. And he really didn't want to get into locomotives because nobody really knew much about them, especially in 1830. The very first 140 or so locomotives you'll find will be English products, mainly because we had to tool up and we had to, steal their technology, which Rogers would actually end up doing. The very first locomotive that Rogers would produce is in the bottom here. This is called the Sandusky. The one up above it, which was the model really, is called the McNeil. The McNeil was the third locomotive that was purchased by the New Jersey Transportation Company. It came over from England, and after you built the locomotive, they disassembled them and sent it in parts. It originally arrived in Jersey City, and nobody could put it together. So a couple people tried. Rogers actually had hired some better people. He looked, he says, yeah, pack this up, get it to my factory in Paterson, I'll put it together for you. Horatio Allen, who had brought the Sturbridge line and really is the father of railroads in the United States, actually had hired him from the South Carolina Railroad to build 100 set of railroad truck wheels. So he was a competent machinist, and he was making just small parts. Once he got the locomotive there, he made a pattern and a copy of every single piece of it. 18 months later, he comes up with the Sandusky. It was supposed to be purchased by the New Jersey Transportation Company, but they couldn't wait so long for it. Again, it took him about a year and a half because he had to, build the machinery, instruct them on how to use it, and of course they had to figure out how to get it to work, which is a William Swinburne who had studied with George Stephenson. So, I always talk to students and you say, how we feel about China, they take our products, they take it apart and they sell it cheaper. Well, now we know how Great Britain felt. The steam engine, the locomotive, the looms, we stole that technology. But you could actually, when you see, it was literally, when they described his works, it was literally an encroachment on the forest. And you have a real good example of the raceway system. You can see the upper and the lower raceways, it was called at the time. And the flume right here, so the water flows this way and then back down, but it flows into here and there's a water wheel here, which that's what really brought the power, and then back down into the river. This is Spruce Street and Market Street. Okay. Garrett Mountain's up top there. The earliest photo I have of about 1860, looking down Spruce Street towards Garrett Mountain. We know this is about 1860 because there's also cannons being made, if you can just notice them in the foreground. Now, I have a couple of photos that we really were suppliers to everywhere but England. You'll find our locomotives in New Zealand. Rogers built almost 6,000 locomotives. Again, from the 1830s, 1840s, everybody was copying everybody. By 1840, everybody was copying Rogers. Rogers was one of the leading manufacturers. Again, much like Hamilton hiring the best people, he hired the best people. They didn't always stay with them, but he hired them and used them as far as he could. And Thomas Rogers was really, a real unique man, a genius. He was always early to bed, early to rise. If he was playing cards and he was winning, and it was like 10 o'clock at night, he'd get up and leave. Because he would have to be at his shop by 6 in the morning at the latest. And he really worked by the adage that the next locomotive that was coming out of his works was going to be better than the one that preceded it. And that's how he ran the works into 1856. One of the most perfectly preserved pre-1870s locomotives. Now, we have locomotives from the 1850s and 60s still around, but they're more representational of 1870s because they would have to keep improving them. But according to John White, who was the former transportation curator at the Smithsonian, the most perfectly preserved pre-1870s locomotive is the 1843 La Junta, which was built at the Rogers Works. It's in Havana to this day, where it was originally used on the sugarcane mill. It's a narrow trail, narrow rail. It's that red model right there. So one day when we can get back to Cuba, this is the engine you got to see. At least I only have a couple things on my bucket list, and I'm going to put that off as long as possible. Rogers was the largest manufacturer, but there were actually 5 locomotive manufacturers, and we manufactured about, again, 10,000 locomotives between 1837 and about 1926. His main competitor was Danford Cook and Company, and actually John Cook was his former superintendent. And what happened in the 1850s is he moved off, went out west to make his fortune, didn't work out so well. He came back to Paterson in 1853. He hooks up with Charles Danford, who's, again, another textile man. They were just making textile machinery as well. And he introduced locomotive building. And ironically, the very first locomotive that would come out, I always wondered if it was like a thumb and a nose to Thomas Rogers. The first locomotive they came out was called the Sandusky as well. And they were unique because they would survive but longer because they would be also part of the founding companies that formed ALCO, the American Locomotive Company, in 1901. I might as well mix a little Civil War in here because the biggest thing, of course, Paterson did do its part. That's a shot of Hugh Irish. He unfortunately passed away. Actually, Captain Charles Danford as well died. Captain Charles Danford Jr. We have some nice letters in our collections from James LaBelle. He was a Paterson baker who, unfortunately, he's only there for about a year and a half because he gets captured and passes. But when you read those old Civil War letters, you feel like you're there. Really, I could do a whole program on that. They're really great. So actually, I think only about 212 people actually, lost their lives in the service of the country back then. Now, the biggest part that we have is, they called it the Great Locomotive Chase. It's the only locomotive chase in the Civil War. But actually, it would result in the very first creation of the Medal of Honor, today issued by Congress, the Congressional Medal of Honor. And it's the Andrews raid of April of 1862. James Andrews, who you see in the center of that group, with the volunteers from the Ohio Regiment, he had the idea that we're going to, commandeer a locomotive and we're going to wreck service between Chattanooga and Atlanta, wreck supply lines and tear up the only problem is when you steal a locomotive, you still got to maintain the schedule, and it doesn't go very fast. The grade is only going about 14 miles an hour at the initial grade. And the real story is really William Fuller, who was the captain of this, or the engineer. Now remember, the earlier locomotives, you'd have dining cars, so you had to stop for breakfast, stop for lunch, and you had to stop frequently to take on more wood to burn, as well as water. So they snuck in the night before, put civilian clothes on, and there were actually 22 of the Ohio volunteers. 2 of them overslept, 20 of them went on. They uncoupled the train, and they stole the general. William Fuller, who's having breakfast, starts first by running after it. Then he gets a pump car. It's like a cartoon. Gets a pump car, and then he starts going through a bunch of locomotives. There's actually 4 locomotives in this chase, but the 2 main ones are the General and the Texas. And the Texas was actually built across the street in 1853 at the Danford Cook and Company. The General, who's at least our star, that was 1856 from Rogers. And the other 2 locomotives, the Yonah, that's also a Rogers engine, and the 4th engine we really don't know. But I never saw the Great Chain Chase, but if you remember with Fess Parker in the late 50s, celebrated or at least fictionalized the Andrews raid. The only one not to get the award, of course, was James Andrews because he was a civilian scout. Actually, the first 7 or 8 of them, they they were hanged, and then the others were prisoner of wars, which were later exchanged. But the general is now in Kennesaw, Georgia, where the actual raid started. That was a big shanty, is where the name of the original town. So you could find it at the Civil War and Southern Railroad Museum, and at the Atlanta Cyclorama, which is, they've relocated the Atlantic History Center now, in the old zoo. They saved the Texas, but what they've done with the Texas is they made it more representational of 1880. They're sort of getting away from its Civil War roots. But the whole journey was actually 87 miles. And 60 or so of the miles were done by the Texas, which you see here. But what's more interesting is the Texas actually did it backwards. It was tender first because it was going in reverse the whole way. What happened with the general is eventually they did cut the line, so they were able to get a head start, so you couldn't do telegraph, and they did wreck some of it, but eventually you just ran out of stuff to burn. They ran out of water, and then they dispersed, but they were all captured. But that's the beginnings. Our glory days would continue, the 1870s, 1880s. In Paris in 1867, they built a locomotive called this is Grant locomotive, the America. Unfortunately, there's no photography of the day, only descriptions where it was, it was oak, it was brightly polished, it had, a lot of silver, brass, it was, a marvel of engineering. And so they would use that until 1896 as their letterhead. And of course, some of the other engines that they built, including some experimental engines that you see all the way in the top corner. Instead of having, connecting rods and pistons, it has a giant one on top with a cog that was supposed to turn the engine. Did not work. And, we actually have some other important engines. When east met west at Promontory Point, the one with the straight stack that came from the east, that was also a Rogers locomotive, 1868. Not the original one that was supposed to be used because the original engineer wouldn't go over the trestle bridge. He was afraid he didn't trust it, so that's how they got this engine. On the left is the Jupiter. That was actually from Schenectady. So imagine getting that locomotive. It went from New York. It had to go down South America and back out to California. So obviously when May 10th, 1896, when the Transcontinental Railroad was established, it saved a lot of time. Although in Paterson, they did not note this one iota. John Ryle, who had the largest mills, May 10th, they all went up in flames. It was over $330,000. He had no insurance. That was the father of the silk industry. And whenever he was quoted, he always talked, I was ruined by fire but saved by water. What he actually did is he also created the Passaic Water Company, which is now Passaic Valley Water Commission. So he gave us, hydrant drinking water. I mean, they may have been industrials, but they did give back, and they did think about the community. In other words, you needed healthy workers. The Rogers Works, from that earlier version that I showed you, this is how much it would extend by 1906, 1909. The Paterson Museum is in the former erecting shop, which is right here. This would serve as the locomotive erecting shop from 1871 to about 1904. When locomotives kept getting larger, then they built this giant one here. Today it's just an empty parking lot with a Burger King in the middle. And their offices, millwright, and planing and turning, these still stand in the storage building. Everything else here is gone. And then there's some of the Danford Cook works left. And we do comprise architecturally the largest in existence 19th century locomotive works. And I got to be honest, during the Civil War, 3/4 of the locomotives that were produced in Paterson and Philadelphia. Baldwin and Norris and Rogers, they were the real big three. Unfortunately, we all lost ground to Baldwin because Baldwin moved out of Philadelphia and relocated to Eddystone, where they had acres and acres. But for an extensive works that it was, nothing exists other than their old administration building. But as you can see from Paterson, we're only 8.4 square miles. They couldn't budge another inch. Although, in addition to locomotives, we also build rotary snow plows. John Leslie and Sons, they came from Canada, and they wanted the best locomotive builders to help build their snowblowers. It's really like a snowblower. The way it would propel the snow about 60 feet. About 2,000 of these are manufactured, but they can't power themselves. If you strip away that box, that just looks like a boxcar, it's actually a locomotive engine, but the engines behind it are what push it. And the way we got our locomotives out of the city was they had to be put on a trolley bed, and they were pulled up by horses. It took about 30 horses. And this was really much to the chagrin of Jacob Rogers. He was probably the wealthiest man in Paterson. He was Thomas Rogers' son. He inherited the works. And he's the only one who actually talked badly about his dad. Kinda. When he said, if everything was true, because he had about 5 or 6 brothers, he had a couple sisters, and they all got their part, but he wanted the works and he got that. But he always alluded that there were a few more brothers and sisters that were around that his mother didn't know about. So that was the only part that Thomas Rogers was, not so dedicated to. But ironically, what he would do is he was our ultimate eccentric, and he would create a museum at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You may have heard that. In 1870, he was not really a member of that, but he was a member of the Union League Club, which is one of the most exclusive clubs in New York then and still is to this day. They were the ones who really started the Met. He inquired about it about 10 years before he passed away, would meet the director. He wanted to know who ran it and wanted to know how its finances worked. And he would give his $10 donation personally. And that was all he did. If he had a 50-cent wall hanging, what he bought with premium of tea, that would have been a tribute to his art appreciation, as his one biographer said. Anyway, when he died, he wanted to cut all his family out. He felt there was no way they were going to get the money. He was a bachelor his whole life, so he gave the Met equivalent to $170 million, which has established the famous Rogers Fund, which I think to this day they purchased over 50,000 items. Back then it was about $5.5 to $6 million is what the gift was in 1901. The very first year they had interest in 1904, it was about 200,000 to 300,000. It made them unstoppable, like the Getty Museum. So next time you go to the Met, the early Christian, the Egyptian collection, you'll see Rogers Fund, Rogers Fund, Rogers Fund. That was the director's go-to fund, and they only spend off of the interest. So that's all that's left of our locomotive industry. But you could do a whole story on, he was a bit of a nut job, but you know what, the one thing that was, with a lot of these guys, they really weren't great humanitarians, but they did take care of their workers. Rogers actually paid the highest salaries, but then when he would talk privately and say, well, everybody's getting paid about $1,000. Well, I'll pay the guy $2,000 because I'll get more than double the work out of him. I mean, he did understand hiring and paying for what he wanted. Gilded Age, the golden age of Paterson. This is bird's eye view. And just to give you an idea one more time, looking at the falls, you can see all the pink buildings. This is from the City Atlas from 1884, and you get the idea how everything's still based along the river. Although by 1859, they're already running steam engines and all, but pretty much the town grew up behind all the locomotive works. And give you an idea how the competition was. This is Rogers, this is Grant Locomotive, this is Cook Locomotive. All three of them, they could look out the window and see each other. And then all the textile factories still run down along here. And again, and they did use the raceway system up until 1913. So you had both before it was supplanted by the hydroelectric plant. And again, this is where you see our greatest growth. In 1860, there were less than 20,000 people, and we moved up to 30, 34. By 1900, one of the few cities that have over 100,000 people. This is 1880. I figured something, a little more glamorous. When they have the Great Falls Festival, they try to get a wire walker. That's Harry Leslie, crossing the falls. Although you see to the right of him, there's a big mountain. That was Morris Mountain. No longer exists. We quarried that down to the ground. Although when I think of the Gilded Age, I always think of probably the most prominent house that still stands, and it's the home of the Passaic County Historical Society. It's owned by the county now, and that would be Lambert's Castle. It was built by Cathalina Lambert as a private residence in 1893, so it's a little bit later. He had a couple of larger homes before that, but what he really did is he amassed this amazing art collection. Although you notice the factory on the lower right-hand corner, his very first factory, which represented what he remembered as a boy growing up in Yorkshire, England, is that was his very first castle-type motif. Most factories are pretty standard, as you've seen them in Paterson. And because, the biggest problem with Paterson, again, I mentioned 8.4 square miles. Initially, everybody had to be near the water because there's only so much riverfront property. So typical of our mills is have 4 and 5 stories. And of course, most of them are narrow. I mean, these are perfect examples. And with the large windows, they let plenty of light in. Of course, everything else is painted white for whitewashing. The average work week in Paterson, during the main days, is really 55 to 60 hours. You normally worked about 10 hours a day and 5 hours on Saturday. And you still got Sunday off, which was nice. And just to give you an idea of some of the photos of, working in the doubling. This is 1880s machinery. Again, most of the machinery you see here was made in Paterson. Again, we really did have it all, except for the cultivation of raw silk. It was the only thing we didn't have. We imported that. 84% of it came from China, another 14% from Japan, and then the rest from northern Italy and France. One of my favorite early photos, because always, we always hear the word fake. Well, most of these photos, of course, are fake because photography was real slow. Remember, the guy had the hood over himself with the, with the front and rear stander. The machine's not moving. That's why every now and then you get those ghost images. But this one section of frame is moving. I highlighted it so you can see how it's spinning. So if the whole thing was running, it would just be a blur. So anytime we see the shots with they had the overhead pulleys and all, you could see the crosses and the supports. You would never see that if it was running. So just to give you an idea, again, I mostly talk to younger children, so they're used to, like, with the cell phone, boom, my God, I can stop action. You'd never stop action with the early ones. What they did is they stopped working. And the reality of working in the mill, especially for ladies around 14, 15, and you should have been in school to 16, but a lot of times it was easy to get out of it. And I got to be honest, the employers weren't checking birth certificates. So you would normally start as a winder. We're going from skeins onto bobbins. One winder would run anywhere from 80 to about 120 spindles. You stand in between the machine. So you see the woman's here. She would watch all of these spinning. There would be one right behind her, and normally you can even see through the frame. And as long as everything's turning, you're doing fine. There's actually 3 people in the shot. Besides her, there's 2 people on that side right there. But I love the shot with the young people working. That's 1907 for a postcard, to give us a little bit more, a color look. Warping, some of the more skilled work involved. And as I mentioned, Benjamin Eastwood, the SIP Machine Company, we built all these things. Again, the locomotive, one industry left brought it to another one. From the machine shops, you went to textiles. From textiles, you would go to locomotives. Although it's not, in this talk from locomotives, we go to airplane engine production, which would really be the big 3. This shot of women working as warpers. We got this one in the Ellis Island because it was unique that a plant would be running that. As one mill owner said, he wanted women because they were cheaper to employ. They liked children because they were monkeys, and they were both malleable. Not very pleasant to talk about your employees, but the reality. Of course, the one thing that, the biggest product that you still find today on eBay are these commemorative silk ribbons. This is the 1892 Centennial ribbon. It actually has 22,000 pieces of string going crossways, fine silk, to make up, which is roughly about maybe 9-10-inch long ribbon, where you can see where you have Old Glory on top, the portrait of Alexander Hamilton, and of course the falls at the bottom. They're pretty amazing, and they were made on the ribbon looms, similar to that you see on the right-hand side. And again, another postcard. What I like about later photography is you actually start seeing, again, most of this is, the guy on the right is about 1900 or so, which is pretty rare. And then the 1930s inside, again, a little muddled to get inside the factories. But typically, whenever you see photos, go look, people used to dress so nice. Well, normally, you hired the photographer. So the gentleman on the right who's pretending to be a weaver with his tie and his, he's got his gray flannel suit on, in his polished shoes, he's not the weaver. You look to the left, that's a weaver. So you get the idea, But they are standing in the right place. You can see how they would normally run between 2 looms. Finished product rolls off of this one and that one. Before they had stop motions, where if the yarn ran out in the shuttle that's going back, you had to stop the machine, replace it. So one man would run 2 looms, then they would go to 4-loom system. And again, if a piece of string broke, the machine would produce an error, so you had to be really keen to quick stop it, tie the knot, repair it, turn it back on while you're watching your other 3 machines. Of course, this would lead to one of the last major silk strike in 1913. And the back of the looms indicate that these don't have stop motions. This is the warp, the long waist thread that's just going through the harnesses, which lift and lower. But if this had stop motion, suspended from there would be little drop wires that if it broke a thread, it would fall down and cut the machine out. That's not on these looms. Once they did put stop motions, though, one man can now operate 6 to 10 looms, and you're really no longer a skilled weaver. You really were just tending the machine. The Passaic River, which powered everything, was oh so beautiful water because it was a soft water, very low in minerals, and it was ideal, and I mean ideal for dyeing. We could dye some beautiful colors, but we were really most known for dyeing blacks because it would be pure black. It didn't have any, if you hold some fabrics, it would have like a little tinge of rust in it and have a little reddish sheen, a little bluish sheen. We could dye midnight. And this is probably the worst business to be in because no matter what time of year you were in there, it was always hot, smelly, it's awful, just awful conditions. But what they produced The one thing black and white photography does not show, because everything was in, shades of gray. This is, again, the spring of 1912. Look, you get the fuchsias and these hot pinks, like the colors that existed. Again, for men's ties, ribbons, but especially ladies' dresses. These are some of the colors that they were dyeing in Paterson before we really polluted the river. One little hero, little aside on history, from 1878 through 1900, who was developing submarines, is Irish immigrant John Philip Holland. He's the inventor of the modern submarine. This is him peering out of his sixth sub, and to the right of him is his very first submarine, which he tested just up above the Passaic Falls back in 1878. Actually, who financed him for his later subs would be the Fenian Brotherhood, essentially the precursor of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. They were really building his submarines today would be called for an act of terrorism. They were funding it, especially after the Irish potato famine when about 2 million of their countrymen had starved to death. As for Holland, he would really build 6 submarines, and his 6th design would be accepted by the Navy on April 11th, 1900. They would purchase her. On October 12th, it would be the very first submarine commissioned in the United States Silent Service Fleet. If you look at Wikipedia, which doesn't lie, every now and then when they change the photos, you'll have the founder of General Dynamics, and they'll show John Holland, peering out of the sub. Actually, John Holland was much like Sam Colt. He had a great invention, so he threw his patent in. It was Isaac Rice from Electric Boat who actually absorbed the John Holland Torpedo Company. And what happened was, when John was no longer satisfied with the work he was doing, he tried to pull out and start up his own company. He got slammed with patent injunctions because he couldn't take his patents back, even though they were his designs. Sam Colt, actually, in 1842, the sheriff's sale, he lost his patents, and his friends felt real bad for him. So they bought it back for him, which was, worthless to him for about 5 years, until 1847, when the Mexican-American War broke out. But other than that, Paterson's still on a high note through the 1890s. Silk's at its greatest. About 24,000 people, more than a quarter of the town are employed in the silk. We have a vice president who's now United States, 1896, in the McKinley-Hobart ticket. Unfortunately, Hobart passes in 1899. Otherwise, we would have had a president regrettably, when McKinley was assassinated in 1901 in Buffalo. Although he was really the toast of the town. He was actually, Garrett Hobart. He was really like the lawyer for the robber barons, I got to be honest. But he didn't like going to court. He was really good with getting both guys in. What's your side of the story? He could compromise. I mean, he was really brilliant at that. He was put on the ticket, though, by the vested interest in New York because they were worried about the Midwesterner and selling out them. So that's why he was really there. But he was really the toast of the town, as I mentioned. And his wife, Jenny Tuttle Hobart, really acted as the first lady. She really wasn't the second lady, because Mrs. McKinley had suffered from epilepsy, and she got really nervous when she had to do state affairs, so it was really Jenny Tuttle that was running everything. And to show his appreciation, McKinley, when Hobart passes, they don't, elect another or put anyone in his place. They left the vice presidency empty and that's how Theodore Roosevelt would get on the ticket. A couple of shots of the way the Paterson was thriving. I can't tell you all the architectural elements that were throughout the city from, you had 70 years of building. It really was a magnificent city, an industrial city. This is looking down our main street towards the bell tower. This is about 1873 and 1880 with the trolley. 1902, the largest fire in the state's history would take place, February 9th, and it would wipe out 28 blocks of Paterson. The whole downtown and business district, and then about a quarter mile away, some of the houses further. I mean, it was a major conflagration. It was perfect timing for it. It was about 20 degrees. Gale force winds are sustained overnight, 20 to 40 miles an hour, and up to 60 with gusts, until it just, turned around and started back on itself. It started shortly after midnight, and it burned through 4:30 the next day. It took over 500 buildings. This is the old library. I mentioned the library because I said they didn't really do anything. That's actually the Charles Danforth Memorial Library. Charles Danforth didn't pay for it, but his daughter, Mary Ryle, she married into the Ryle family. She gave the money of their father's house to renovate it and actually paid to expand it, except it went up in flames. And it's the very first free public library in the state of New Jersey, I have to say. Back in 1885, we created library law. But as you can see, Main Street and Market Street were rebuilt very nice. We could date these even without dates because in 1904 they built the Second National Bank, which is missing right there, to help date with the postcards. in a shot with the parade coming down. Again, the building's still missing, so we know this is one of the, I think it's a GAR coming down, Grand Army of the Republic. Progressive era is where things start getting a little hairier. Again, every 5 to 10 years, there was some kind of strike going on, but conditions, really weren't the best in Paterson, got to admit. But the populations are getting bigger and bigger. It's funny when you see, if you lived in Europe, they come out with a few of these books, Views of Paterson. And you have the city hall on the left, on the right is the state county courthouse. On the left is the new Charles Danforth Memorial Library. Actually, Mary Ryle gave about $5 million plus the insurance to, ensure that there would be a memorial to her father, which exists to this day. Actually, that building's on the historic registry because the architect of that in 1903 was Henry Bacon. 1922, of course, he does the Lincoln Memorial. A lot of the items, architectural elements incorporated in the Lincoln Memorial were first done here. Although Bright and Bacon, he was part of a New York firm. They built a Jersey City library in 1901, so they're really known for that public works. And the building on the left was actually built in 97, but survived the fire. That would be the Hamilton Club, where the city business was really done. But what I really like is this shot here, and the way it lists the for the housing, typical homes of Paterson. Typical residence. I always thought typical meant what the average guy lived in. Real quick, this would be John W. Griggs. He was governor. Actually, he was the first governor who resigned in 1896 because he took the cabinet position as the attorney general for the Hobart McKinley administration. Frederick Cook, he owned Danforth Cooking Company. The Hobart House is right there. That's where the vice president lived. And he had an art gallery attached to it. Kent was a general store owner, equivalent to a department store today. And I.A. Hall, whose home on Hamilton Ave, he supplied textile machinery and extra parts. So these are like the most well-to-do people. And of course, Lambert's Castle. Again, representative type homes. Did not represent what the average silk worker lived in. Unfortunately, there's no photos of these until about 1930 when Lewis Hine came by. You had Jacob Reese, Hines, they were with the muckrakers, really getting to the gist of what was going on. It really sort of got swept, though, under the rug for ages. Paterson was such a powerhouse. 1912, we have our own section in the monthly Silk magazine. We were the leading manufacturer, leading inventors, loom improvements, machine shops were really bustling along. They could have never saw a year later that we would have one of the major silk strikes that would shut down the industry for 6 months, which would eventually end up being a failure. It gets a lot of play because this is when you saw the movie Reds with John Reed. John Reed was here. He's one of the few Americans that's actually, I think he's the only American buried in, or parts of him are buried in the Kremlin Wall. You had all the communists, the anarchists, the international, the Wobblies, international workers of the world. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was only 18 at the time, and of course they were arrested many times in Paterson. Big Bill Haywood, I think parts of him are too. And it is parts, like a little bit of him is in the Kremlin Wall. Again, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and the Botto House is where they all met. So if you come to the Paterson Museum, you can also go to the next town over, Halden, and you'll see where the American Labor Museum is. It was the home of Pietro and Maria Botto, and what they did is they were holding the silk strikes here. On the second floor balcony is where John Reed and the rest of them would speechify, as I would say. But they were allowed there because they had a socialist mayor in Halden. In Paterson, you need a parade permit to gather, and they gathered about 10,000 people. But as you can see by the police who were lined up there along Mill Street, the police were definitely pro-management. But it would pass. 1914, we're still leading the way. We're in the Armory. We used to have annual, Paterson industrial exhibitions, where from around the world. The very first international silk conference took place in Paterson. So things were looking back up in 1914. The raceway system was replaced by the hydroelectric plant. And actually, that plant would run from 1914 to 1969 when a flood finally wiped it out. Although it has been reactivated since, and since '84, it's been turning some money. But the real climax in Paterson's heyday, and especially for the silk and all, would be the outbreak of World War I. That really shut down, of course, silk production. but mainly changes in fashion started happening. The artificial silks, rayon, and the synthetics started taking over. And more importantly, it was expensive in Paterson. The SUM charged a lot. Intercontinental rail going back and forth, no problem. Everybody started moving out to Pennsylvania. Even, what do you call it? Catalina Lambert in Hawley, Pennsylvania. There's a factory out there shaped like a castle. I had a feeling it was his. It was his. Because the problem with Paterson, again, we paid more than anybody, because it's like, if I have a factory, I'll take, hypothetically, $1 an hour. Oh, you'll pay $1.05, $1.10. We're always bidding up. They all started moving their plants out to Hawley. We'll give you 75 cents an hour. You don't like it, go back to the, coal mines. So, they did what they had to do. But after 6 months, it was really a failed, strike, because the workers, couldn't, feed themselves any longer. And the unions are in their infancy, so, they sort of crossed their own lines. Some manufacturers went out of business. Some just moved everything either out west or down south, where they had absolutely no labor problems. And that would be pretty much, the beginning of the end. So from 1920 on down, little by little, we would slowly lose our base. Those large factories would later be chopped up as like cockroach shops, as they would call them. Originally, I'd have a 4-story building, and it would be just my factory. Now you could find anywhere from 4 to 8 concerns, depending on how they would, take chicken wire and divide up the buildings. And, but Paterson would have one more, during World War II with the Wright's Aeronautical, but you're not going to hear about that tonight.